Our story begins with a man hollowing out the floor beneath his bed, digging frantically like a marmot until he has carved out a hole 3 meters deep. In his past life, he had been far too flashy, leading a demonic cultivator to break in at midnight and turn him into a human egg, a truly gruesome end. Having been given a second chance, he would rather pretend to be useless forever than stand out, so he lines the pit with lethal poison. He even buries pressure-sensitive stone spikes inside. If any blind demonic cultivator takes a single step into the room, they will be silently killed. They would become nothing more than high-quality fertilizer, while deep in the mines, sparks fly, and the air is thick with choking smoke. Amidst the scent of earth, Yi Chinzhou grips his iron pickaxe, his arms aching and trembling uncontrollably as he bites his tongue and swings. He puts his full weight into slamming the pickaxe against the hard stone, the violent vibration traveling up the wooden handle to his hands. His palms feel numb and ready to split, while sweat mixed with lime powder stings his eyes, a piercing pain he cannot even pause to soothe. He doesn't dare wipe them, moving instead like a heartless machine, mechanically swinging his blade because he knows he cannot stop in this place. In this ghostly hell, stopping means a vicious whipping or even losing one's life, and even now, Yi Chinzhou's mind is still a bit of a mess. Just 3 days ago, he was a mere office worker pulling overtime. In the blink of an eye, he was transported to this cruel cultivation world. He didn't become a peerless genius or find a mysterious mentor. Instead, he became a lowly mining laborer at the bottom of the Tianxian sect. Here, he has no rights and no status. In the eyes of the cultivators, these laborers are worth less than dogs. They are pure consumables. His daily task is to dig day and night in front of mines that could collapse at any moment, all for a meager bit of food. Failing to meet the mining quota results in a beating at best, or being thrown to the monsters on the back mountain at worst. Suddenly, a crack echoes nearby. A scream like a slaughtered pig follows as the overseer, Zhao Taizhan, approaches, cursing while clutching a black leather whip studded with barbs. With a face full of scars, he is only at the 3rd level of qi refining. Yet to these mortal laborers, he is essentially a living god of death. Nearby, a frail laborer who can no longer endure leans against the rock wall to catch his breath, unfortunately putting himself right in the line of fire. Without a word, Zhao Taizhan lashes out with his whip, instantly shredding the laborer's thin hemp clothes and tearing into his back. A deep, horrific wound appears, and the man collapses to the ground, trembling uncontrollably despite the piercing agony he feels. The man scrambles away in agony, clutching the mine entrance while gasping for air and sobbing, begging for mercy and promising that he will immediately get back to digging and never dare to be lazy again. Nearby, the other laborers are so terrified they hardly dare to breathe, and those who wanted to plead for him quickly swallow their words. In this cruel cultivation world, standing out without strength is a death sentence. Yi Chinzhou knows his survival depends on one rule: keep your head down. He works steadily, never causing trouble. Zhao Taizhan passes behind him with his whip, glancing at the pile of crushed ore at Chinzhou's feet. Seeing the young man's steady, machine-like movements, the overseer grunts in satisfaction and struts toward the next area, which, to be honest, is a massive relief. Only when the footsteps fade completely does Chinzhou finally allow his tense back to relax. Taking advantage of a brief breath, he whispers a command in his mind. Suddenly, a semi-transparent blue screen appears, something only he can see. This is his only trump card in this world, the attribute extraction panel. It is incredibly simple, with no flashy graphics or voice. Just a few lonely lines of text. Host, Yi Chinzhou. Cultivation, mortal. Available attribute points, 0. Its function, however, is brutally effective. As long as his hand touches a dead object or a living being, he can extract their attributes and perfectly merge them into his own body. When he first discovered this golden finger, Chinzhou nearly shouted for joy, wanting to immediately grab a spirit stone too, extract its energy and soar in power. But he forced himself to stop. According to his predecessor's memories, the Tianxian sect's control over spirit stones is extreme. Every stone is checked 3 times. If he touched one and it turned into a useless rock, he'd be caught instantly. Zhao Taizhan would surely kill him on the spot. He knows that the bird that sticks its head out gets shot, and only the patient survive. For 3 days, he has resisted temptation and worked as a humble laborer, all to find a perfectly safe target for extraction. Suddenly, a gong echoes. The sound signals the end of the shift. The laborers drop their tools as if a great weight has been lifted, collapsing to the ground before forming a long line to carry their heavy baskets to the screening area. Chinzhou blends into the crowd, his or count, hitting the exact passing mark. He isn't the best, nor the worst, perfectly invisible. While the others rush like madmen toward the kitchen, Chinzhou stands perfectly still. His gaze is locked onto a massive pile of waste material in the corner of the screening area. Piled high in the pit are mountains of discarded iron slag, hard, devoid of spiritual energy, and so useless even a mortal blacksmith would reject them. To the sect, this is nothing but pure trash. Every night, someone hauls it to the back mountains, and absolutely no one pays it any mind. Yi Chinzhou takes a deep breath and grabs a large broom, walking quickly toward a 2-meter-high pile of this discarded iron. He pretends to clean near the slag mountain. There is no one around, and the registration manager has long since stopped checking. He drops the broom and presses his right hand firmly against a head-sized piece of rough, pitch-black iron slag. In his mind, he commands the panel to start the extraction. A pale blue screen pops up instantly. Discarded iron slag detected. The slag immediately loses its luster, crumbling into a pile of gray-white powder that slips through his fingers. The panel confirms the success. Hardness +1. Shinjo feels a rush of excitement as he thrusts both hands directly into the massive pile of iron slag. The panel notifications flash frantically before his eyes. The slag visibly turns to ash, and in less time than it takes to burn half an incense stick. A large section of the pile has been sucked dry. His hardness attribute soars to 100 points. He quickly stops himself. If he continues, the pile will collapse, and there would be no way to explain it. He uses his feet to mix the powder with mud. After destroying all traces, Shinjo silently commands the system to merge the 100 points of hardness into his skin. An ice-cold sensation erupts from his heart, following his bloodstream to every corner of his body in an instant. His skin feels as if it's being pierced by countless icy needles, not painful, but tightened to the absolute limit. It's a strange sensation, to be sure. It feels as if high-density liquid metal is being forcibly woven into his muscle fibers. After a few breaths, the feeling finally fades. Shinjo pinches his forearm and finds the texture has completely changed. His ordinary flesh now feels as tough as century-old ox hide. He squeezes with all his might, yet he can't even leave a white mark. He picks up a sharp stone shard and aims it at his own hand. He slashes hard. The sharp stone slides across his skin as if it were a plate of solid iron, leaving only a faint trace. With a light rub of his thumb, the mark vanishes completely. Shinjo can't help but gasp at the sheer absurdity of it all. If the lowest grade attribute from waste slag can make him invulnerable at 100 points, imagine what more could do. He walks quickly back toward the kitchen. With this hardness attribute as a safety net, he finally feels a flicker of security in this immortal cultivation world. The next morning, the four-eared bronze gong rings out once more, herding all the laborers back down into the depths of the Dinklass mine shafts. We see that the environment in Mining Area 4 is even worse, with water seeping from the walls and mud everywhere as Shinjo lifts his heavy iron pick. He slams the pick into the rock face, and the moment the impact rings out, his eyes light up. Yesterday, the vibration would have rattled his very bones. But today, the shock traveling to his hands feels as if it's being absorbed by an invisible suit of iron armor. There is, quite remarkably, no pain at all. Instead, the tension in his arms seems to grant him even greater strength. His pick becomes a blur, and his mining efficiency instantly doubles. He plans to finish early to save his energy for more attribute extraction tonight. But as he focuses on the stubborn rock, a sound catches his ear. A faint cracking noise echoes from above. Beside him, an old laborer screams in terror, straining his voice to warn him of the danger. Shinjo looks up sharply to see a slab of rock weighing hundreds of pounds that has completely broken loose from the ceiling of the shaft. It whistles through the air, falling straight toward his head. The space is too cramped and the mud too thick. There is simply no room to dodge. In this split second, Shinjo instinctively raises his iron pick horizontally in front of his body to block the crushing weight. The massive rock slams into the thick iron tool with terrifying force. To be honest, the impact is enough to shatter most ordinary men. The iron pick is actually bent and snapped by the sheer weight. The sharp, heavy head of the tool spins out of control, rebounding through the air. With violent momentum, the broken metal head smashes directly back toward the back of Shinjo's hand. It is far too close and moving far too fast. The surrounding laborers shut their eyes tight, bracing for the gore. But a second later, the expected blood and bone do not appear. The metal shards strike Shinjo's hand, yet instead of a scream, there is only the crisp, clear ring of iron striking iron as dust fills the cave. The old laborer nearby collapses into the mud, completely dazed. Shinjo, meanwhile, uses the rising limestone dust as a convenient cover. He quickly pulls his hand back into his sleeve, hiding the fact that he is entirely unharmed, which, naturally, is the only way to keep his secret safe in a place like this. Feigning a look of shock, he scrambles backward and intentionally tosses the broken pick aside, leaving the old man to wonder what he just witnessed. The old man stammers in disbelief, telling him he's incredibly lucky. If that rock had hit him directly, his hand would have been flattened into a pulp. Shinjo simply offers a humble, simple-minded laugh, claiming he just got lucky and only scraped the skin. He quickly grabs a handful of dust, smearing it over the back of his hand to fake a bandage. He manages to fool everyone quite easily, and just like that, several days pass by. Soon, the end of the month arrives, the dreaded day of the performance review. In the center of the courtyard, a dozen large black wooden crates are lined up. We see the overseer, Zhao Taizhan, sitting in a grand chair and fiddling with 2 jade stones, flanked by several fierce-looking enforcement disciples. The manager shouts the name Qian Youfu, announcing his results. 80 pounds of low-grade spirit ore. For exceeding the quota, he is rewarded. His prize is half a chi-gathering pill. A wave of envious gasps erupts from the crowd as a beaming Qian Yofu steps forward to claim it. Chinzhou watches closely as the man takes the pill. As soon as Yofu steps down, the eyes of several veteran laborers around him change. They stare at his pocket like hungry wolves. Deep down, Chinzhou knows the truth. In a cannibalistic place like this, showing off wealth is a death sentence. Soon enough, the manager calls Chinzhou's name. Carrying his mining basket and keeping his head low, he walks toward the crates. He pours his collection of ore into the box with a loud clatter. The disciple in charge of the scales glances at the beam with a blank expression. He flatly announces the result, 50 pounds of low-grade ore. It's a bare pass, earning him only the minimum ration of a single pound of spirit rice. Zhao Taizhan doesn't even bother to lift an eyelid. To him, a useless laborer who barely hits the passing mark, neither excelling nor failing, is invisible. He doesn't even have the energy to scold such a person. Chinzhou respectfully accepts the small bag of shriveled spirit rice and hunches his shoulders. He retreats into the most inconspicuous corner of the crowd. A few laborers who were eyeing him see his pathetic rations and immediately look away in disdain. Chinzhou lets out a cold laugh in his mind. This is exactly the result he wanted, to be a man with absolutely no presence at all. It wasn't that he couldn't mine more or over the last few days. Rather, he deliberately smashed the extra stones and tossed them into the waste pit. After all, what use is half a low-quality pill if you aren't alive to use it? Later that night, as the bunkhouse echoes with thunderous snoring, Chinzhou suddenly snaps his eyes open. Like a black cat, he creeps off his bed and slips out of the courtyard along the base of the wall. He doesn't head for the usual scrap metal pit this time. Over the past few days, he has already scouted out a much better location. Following a hidden path behind the bitter wind, he makes his way to a ravine where Danxia Peak dumps its waste, a place filled with piles of pitch black residue from failed pills. It reeks of a pungent, scorched smell, the remains of alchemical experiments gone wrong, saturated with violent fire toxins and impurities. If anyone dared to cultivate using this slag, their meridians would shatter by morning, leading to a swift and painful death. But for Chinzhou, this is an unguarded mountain of gold. He squats before the heap of waste, rubs his hands together, and plunges them directly into the warm, charred medicinal dregs. In his mind, he commands the panel to activate and begin the extraction. A pale blue light screen pops up instantly. Detected waste pill residue, extractable attributes, fire toxin, and trace amounts of spiritual chi. The waste dregs lose their final glimmer of luster, turning into a pile of odorless gray ash. Meanwhile, clumps of pure spiritual energy, completely free of impurities, surge through his arms and into his limbs. It feels like a parched traveler finally finding rain. His withered meridians expand rapidly under the wash of pure chi, becoming resilient and strong. He needs no cultivation techniques or conscious guidance. The chi extracted by the panel is forced directly into him, automatically converting into foundational cultivation. His bones emit a faint cracking sound, and the void in his dantian quickly condenses into a fist-sized vortex that spins faster and faster. Once the energy is fully absorbed, Chinzhou's cultivation silently breaks through to the second level of chi refining. However, he immediately uses the panel to lock down his external aura. The next morning, the first thing Chinzhou does upon opening his eyes is check the panel, ensuring his exposed aura is firmly suppressed at the first level. To be safe, he even makes his aura look a bit unstable. He now appears like a severely malnourished laborer, on the verge of collapse, a weakling no one would notice. He splashes some water on his face and pushes open the drafty wooden door. The courtyard of the labor quarters is already buzzing with excitement. Several laborers who received their rewards yesterday are gathered in a huddle. Qian Yofu stands in the center and lets out a sudden shout. A fist-sized orange flame flickers to life in his palm, and he proudly announces that this is the flame bullet technique, which he just traded for at the outer sect. The surrounding laborers immediately erupt in. Flattery pours in as the others claim that since he's mastered a spell, he'll surely enter the outer sect next month. But just as the words leave their mouths, the weak flame flickers twice and promptly dies out. Meanwhile, Chinzhou passes by carrying a battered water bucket, not even bothering to give them a second glance. To him, flashy things like the flame bullet or water summoning techniques are purely invitations to a quick death. Imagine meeting an enemy at midnight. You spend ages chanting, only for a blinding light to suddenly erupt in your hand. It's essentially sticking a sign on your forehead that screams, "Come and kill me." Fighting with built-in glowing effects only helps your enemies find their target. In this world of the strong devouring the weak, more people vanish daily than there are stray dogs in the wind. Chinzhou has long since carved caution into his very bones. He firmly avoids anything flashy. The more invisible he remains, the longer he will live. After setting down his bucket, he wanders over to the most remote, abandoned library in the labor quarters. Usually, not even a ghost visits this place. The shelves are piled high with thick dust and tattered books, and the old man in charge is sprawled out on a rocking chair, snoring loud enough to shake the heavens. Chinzhou tiptoes inside and begins rummaging through a pile of junk used to prop up table legs. After a long search, he pulls out a threadbare book that's practically falling apart. He brushes off the dust, revealing 4 crooked characters on the cover. Basic insights. This is essentially a physical combat manual for mortal warriors. The book doesn't even teach how to circulate spiritual chi. It's entirely focused on the basic movements of how to swing and hack with a sword. Even the most useless servant in the sect would despise this, feeling that practicing it would be an insult to the path of cultivation. But this is exactly what Shinjo wants. No light shows, no special effects, and no chi fluctuations. It's perfectly silent and discreet. He takes the tattered book to the entrance and taps lightly on the table. The old gatekeeper wakes up, rubbing his eyes, and glances at the book. With a face full of disdain, he asks why he's taking such trash, noting that this doesn't even qualify as a low-tier cultivation technique. He claims that practicing this for a lifetime would, at best, make him a mortal blacksmith. Shinjo just scratches his head sheepishly. With a forced smile, he explains that his daily work is exhausting, and he just wants to use the movements to stretch his body and strengthen his bones through basic swordplay. Today's task is to chop 500 pounds of black iron wood, a material so incredibly hard it feels like raw iron. Normally, a day of swinging an axe at this would leave a man's palms cracked and bleeding, but Shinjo isn't worried at all. The hardness attribute he extracted on his first day has long since integrated into his skin. He picks up a battered axe with a curled blade. In his mind, he repeatedly visualizes the first move from basic insights, the cleave. There are no flashy movements, just a slight bend of the knees. His waist generates a sudden burst of power that flows through his shoulders and into his arms, finally concentrating entirely into the broken axe. With a crisp crack, the rusty axe strikes the grain of the black iron wood with surgical precision, splitting the hard wood clean in two. The moment the wood splits, his interface flashes. The movement meets the criteria, and his proficiency in basic swordplay increases by 1. Shinjo's eyes widen in realization. He was right. This cheat code of his doesn't actually require him to be holding a real sword. As long as the power, technique, and trajectory match the core of the sword move, his daily labor can be converted into combat mastery. He immediately transforms into a god of labor, working with a sudden, frantic energy. He is no longer just mindlessly chopping wood. With every swing, he meticulously adjusts his breathing, angle, and strength. Each strike is calculated to be as efficient as possible. He wastes not a single ounce of energy, nor does he use too little. By the end of the morning, after 300 precise strikes, his understanding of the cleave has skyrocketed. While a normal person's arms would be screaming in pain after such exertion, Shinjo is protected by his hardness attribute. He remains unharmed, and his muscles actually begin to adapt to this extreme way of moving. Around noon, Yofu passes by the woodshed. Seeing Shinjo drenched in sweat, he lets out a mocking laugh. He tells him that no matter how well he chops wood, he'll never learn to fly, suggesting he spend more time sensing spiritual chi instead. Shinjo stops and wipes his brow, replying with a simple, honest smile that his talent is poor, so he'd better just finish his work. Yofu mutters that he's a hopeless case, rolls his eyes, and walks away. To be honest, Shinjo couldn't care less about the insult. He turns back and grips his axe, watching his proficiency bar tick up once more. That afternoon, we find Shinjo at the abandoned mine. He lifts a heavy mining pick and stares intently at the rough ore, his mind already beginning to visualize the next movement. He shifts his focus to another technique from his basic insights. Gripping the pickaxe with both hands, he braces his legs against the ground like a coiled spring. Like a powerful bow suddenly released, the tip of the pickaxe turns into a blur, slamming into the rock with enough force to send shards flying everywhere. His proficiency ticks up once more. Whether he is thrusting, sweeping, or slashing, Shinjo breaks down every single movement of mining into a sword strike. In the dim light of the mine, he delivers strike after strike with frantic energy. While others rely on brute force to dig, Shinjo relies on micro-precision. To keep a low profile and avoid unwanted attention, he intentionally slows his output, ensuring every strike lands precisely on worthless waste rock. By the end of the day, the amount of ore he turns in barely meets the minimum requirement, which was exactly his plan all along. The overseer gives him a look of pure disdain, waving him away like a bothersome fly. And so, the days begin to turn into months. Half a year passes, and the faces of the laborers change as people come and go. Even Yofu, the man who mocked him, meets a bitter end. After a late-night brawl over a low-grade spirit stone, Yofu is left injured and tossed out of the sect like trash. Meanwhile, Shinjo remains as steady as ever. He continues his daily routine of chopping wood and mining without fail. He has become so unremarkable that his presence is almost impossible to detect. Sometimes people walk right past him without even noticing he's there, simply because he has suppressed his breathing and movements to the absolute limit. However, behind that quiet exterior, the numbers on his interface are jumping at a terrifying speed. His understanding of swordplay has reached an incredible level. At this point, even if he were holding nothing but a simple chopstick, a casual flick of his wrist would perfectly align with the core principles of the sword. His movements are fast, accurate, and ruthless, with not a single ounce of wasted energy. One late night, 6 months later, we find him in his dark hut. Standing before his narrow bed, Chinjo holds a discarded iron sword he found in the mine. The blade is chipped in a dozen places, and the hilt is rotting away. His expression is unreadable, his eyes as calm as still water. Slowly, he raises the rusty iron sword and delivers a gentle swing into the empty air. There is no sound of wind, no whistle of a blade. The strike is so unnervingly quiet it makes one's skin crawl, as if the air itself has been silenced. That seemingly ordinary swing slices through the air, and suddenly, his interface erupts with a blinding red light. Something has changed. After 10,000 repetitions, his basic swordplay has finally broken through, evolving to grant him a special attribute, extreme sharpness. On the 5th day of the month, the usual day for distributing rations, a long line forms outside the steward's office. For these laborers, it is the most important day. A single pound of low-grade spirit rice isn't just food, it's the faint hope of improving one's cultivation. We see Chinjo blending into the back of the line. With his hands tucked into his sleeves, he looks like a sleepy wooden statue. Meanwhile, the steward, Zhao Taizhan, reclines in his chair, tossing snacks into his mouth. A laborer named Zhou Dazhuang steps forward to collect his rations. He weighs the bag in his hand and immediately panics. It's far too light. He protests that it isn't even a pound, asking if the rule wasn't 2 pounds a month. Dazhuang clutches his stomach as he is shoved to the ground. His rice spills everywhere. Zhao Taizhan steps forward, grinding the precious grains into the dirt with his boot as he begins to shout. He declares that his word is the only rule. Since last month's production was low and his own bonuses were cut, he intends to take it out on these useless workers. He asks them if they expect him to pay out of his own pocket. It's half a pound of rice. Take it or leave it, and if they don't like it, they can get out. The entire crowd of laborers is too terrified to even breathe. Taizhan is at the 4th level of qi refining. If he kills a worker, no one will even ask questions. When it's Chinjo's turn, he trots forward quickly. In an instant, his face transforms into a mask of smooth, practiced flattery. But Taizhan raises a hand to stop his subordinate from handing over the rice. He sneers, mentioning he's heard Chinjo has been quite the slacker lately. He notes that Chinjo always hits the bare minimum requirement for ore, and demands to know if he is intentionally hiding the good stuff. This is a blatant shakedown, and the surrounding laborers cast looks of pity toward him. Chinjo simply chuckles and keeps up his humble act. He tells the steward that with his weak physique, hitting the minimum already takes every ounce of his strength. To be honest, he's a very convincing actor. Instead of taking the measly half-pound of rice, he reaches into his robe and pulls out the small portion he managed to save from the previous month. He respectfully presses the bag into Tieshan's hand, claiming the steward works too hard and that he himself hasn't had much of an appetite lately. He suggests the steward use it to make some nourishing porridge. Taizhan is momentarily stunned before he weighs the bag and lets out a loud, mocking laugh. He tells Chinjo that he appreciates the filial gesture and barks at him to get back to work. Chinjo quickly agrees, bowing his head. He offers a polite salute and turns to leave the steward's courtyard. As he walks away, a few other workers catch up to him in disbelief. They ask if he's lost his mind, giving away his last savings when Taizhan is already bullying them so badly. One even suggests they should fight back. Chinjo just looks at them. Fight back with what? They are only at the 1st or 2nd level of qi refining, while their oppressor is at the 4th. He tells them that if they want to fight, they can go ahead, but he intends to stay alive. With that, Chinjo quickens his pace toward his hut. He knows perfectly well that if he hadn't bribed Zhao Taizhan, the man would have attacked. With his current, hardened skin and extreme sharpness attributes, defeating Taizhan wouldn't actually be difficult. However, if he fought back, the sex formations would detect his cultivation level, and his secret panel would be exposed. Risking being dissected by the high-level elders just for a pound of rice is a fool's errand. As long as he's alive, he can survive on tree bark. After all, he can use his panel to extract nutrients from anything. As night falls, Chinjo gnaws on a dry bun, his mind remaining alert. He realizes that if Taizhan is in a foul mood, he might barge in at any moment. He decides he must set a trap right here in his room. He walks to his bed, lifts the wooden boards, and reaches into the corner to reveal the dry, hard dirt floor beneath. We see him prepare his hand. His fingers, infused with the hardened attribute, shimmer with a dark metallic light under the moon. Suddenly, he thrusts his hand into the earth. He pulls out a large chunk of solid dirt without even scratching his skin. In this moment, his hands have essentially become a human excavator. He digs furiously beneath where his bed once sat, filling buckets with the soil. He plans to dump it off the cliff tomorrow morning, completely undetected. An hour later, a vertical pit 2 meters long and 3 meters deep is finished. Even a mid-stage qi refiner would break their legs falling into this. But for Chinjo, this is far from enough. He jumps out of the hole and selects a dozen of the hardest black ironwood logs from his woodpile. He pulls out the rusty iron sword from under his bed and activates extreme sharpness. With a flick of his wrist, the blade begins to dance. Shadows of the blade flash past, and the hardwood is instantly carved into dozens of incredibly sharp, lethal spikes. A bit extreme, perhaps, but effective. Next, he pulls a tattered paper bundle from under the bed. Inside is a toxic powder he extracted from dead rats and poisonous insects using his panel. A single touch of this powder causes total paralysis. Chinjo jumps back into the pit to arrange the poison and the deadly wooden spikes. He covers the entire bottom of the pit with a terrifying density of traps. After dumping the last 2 buckets of soil over the cliff, Chinjo doesn't rush back to his hut. He brushes the dust from his hands and looks toward an overgrown path along the edge of the precipice. No one ever takes this path because of the moss-covered stone tablet standing at the entrance. On it, for crooked words are carved, forbidden poisonous mirror bottom. Everyone in the sect knows that the area behind this stone tablet is a place where no one returns from. And yet, that is exactly where he is headed. We see a stretch of poisonous marsh that has existed for ages, a place so sinister it remains perpetually shrouded in thick, purple-green miasma. It isn't just a threat to low-level servants like him. Even the senior disciples from the inner sect, who have reached the middle or late stages of chi refining, dare not venture inside. It is said the toxic vapors are so dense that a single breath of the waste air can rot one's lungs instantly. Once, an inner disciple chasing a rare venomous beast charged into the swamp, only to never be seen again. Not even a whole corpse remained. Only a few blackened skeletal remains were ever recovered from the edge. Since then, this place has become a ghost gate that everyone avoids. But as Yi Chinjo watches the rolling fog, his eyes burn with excitement. Others fear this place, but he craves exactly what no one else wants. Of course, Chinjo isn't foolish enough to face it with his bare skin. He runs back to his hut and heads straight for the stove. He scoops out half a basin of black charcoal, crushes it into fine bits with a stone, and tears the thickest cloth from his bedsheets. He dampens the cloth and tightly packs the charcoal bits inside, finally inserting a hollow reed to serve as an air vent. And just like that, a crude, makeshift, but likely effective gas mask is ready. Half an hour later, Chinjo stands before the stone tablet once more. He presses the cloth bundle against his face, ties it securely behind his head, bites down on the reed, and takes a deep breath. The air passing through the charcoal carries a smoky, earthy taste, but it successfully filters out the most pungent, stinging odors. Without a moment's hesitation, he plunges into the purple-green fog. As he crosses the threshold, the exposed skin on his neck and arms immediately begins to prickle with a dense, stinging pain, as if thousands of invisible ants are gnawing at his flesh. Even his skin, which had already merged with the hardened attribute, begins to show abnormal faint streaks. The poison is trying to penetrate his pores. Chinjo doesn't panic. He immediately issues an extraction command in his mind. The panel flashes with a cold, blue light. The system detects the mixed toxic density and announces a successful extraction. He has gained 1 point of poison resistance. He chooses to merge this into his skin and blood, and the stinging sensation eases instantly. He can't help but grin. He continues deeper, where the fog grows even thicker and the surrounding trees have all turned a withered, charred black. Slimy green liquid drips from the bare branches, and the ground is littered with the bleached white bones of unknown beasts. On the panel, notifications flicker incessantly. Poison resistance +1, +1, +2. Yi Chinjo moves like a tireless vacuum, madly extracting every toxin from the surrounding air as he walks. An hour passes, and he has already circled the outer edge of the marsh. The stinging sensation on his skin has vanished completely. Now, the toxic miasma hitting his body feels like nothing more than a gentle breeze, leaving not even a red mark. His poison resistance attribute has been forced up to a staggering 1,500 points. With the outer toxins nearly depleted and his points slowing down, Chinjo turns his gaze toward the deeper, darker reaches of the swamp. There are no trees there, only bubbling black mud pits. He steps onto a patch of dry ground, cautiously approaching a basin-sized pit that gurgles and spits, emitting a nauseating, acidic stench. Suddenly, a stray gray rat scurries by, loses its footing, and tumbles into the mud. It only has time to let out one short, sharp shriek of terror. In just 2 or 3 seconds, skin and bone alike dissolve into a pool of black water. Not a single trace remains. The sight makes Chinjo's skin crawl, but instead of retreating, his heart begins to race with a different kind of excitement. If he could extract this and use it as a weapon, a 4th-level chi refiner like Zhao Taizhan wouldn't stand a chance. One slap, and his enemy would turn to ash. Not daring to touch it directly yet, he picks up a dry branch and gently pokes the surface of the mud. The moment it touches the liquid, the tip hisses violently and erupts in a plume of white smoke. Chinjo immediately commands an extraction. The panel flashes. High-intensity corrosive substance detected. Extraction successful. He gains 1 point of corrosion and chooses to merge it into the bone and skin of his index fingers. He feels a very faint, numbing itch. He tosses aside the half-dissolved branch and hovers his hands directly over the mud pit to begin extracting like a madman. Corrosion +1, +5, +10. As the points soar, the black liquid in the pit visibly begins to clear and the pungent, acidic smell fades away. When the pit is completely drained and turned into ordinary water, Chinjo's corrosion attribute has reached 2,000 points. He stands up and looks at his hands. His fingers now shimmer with an eerie, ghostly green luster. He reaches out toward a fist-sized rock nearby, He lightly taps the stone, and white smoke instantly billows from the surface as it begins to melt. Within seconds, it turns into a bubbling puddle of gray water. Suddenly, the deafening toll of a bronze bell echoes from the main peak, causing all of Key Peak to erupt in excitement. Today is the sect's triennial outer sect competition. It's the only day laborers can openly slack off and head to the front mountain to join the festivities. Laborers, usually driven like pack mules by their supervisors, now gather in groups to rush forward. They urge each Shinjo to hurry, claiming that if they're late, there won't even be standing room. Today, intersect elders will personally observe, and senior sister Shen Qingxuang, known as the cold-faced Rakshasa, will also take the stage. But one laborer groans, claiming the moldy bread from last night is wreaking havoc on his stomach. Like a lazy donkey suddenly finding its spark, he vanishes in a cloud of dust. As the crowds on Key Peak disappear, the pained expression on Shinjo's face instantly vanishes. To be honest, he sees no point in watching a group of mid to late stage chi refiner weaklings peck at each other like chickens. What is the appeal in that? He knows that if a hot-tempered senior brother gets carried away and a stray sword beam flies into the spectator's stands, a mere laborer would be wounded by a graze and killed by a direct hit. Seeking out such excitement is simply a death wish. Instead, Shinjo turns and heads straight for the task hall at the back of Key Peak. The place is deserted, save for a semi-bald man named Sun Jishir, who is slumped over the desk, napping. While everyone else has run off to the competition, Shinjo steps forward and lightly taps the table. He tells the man that since his talent is poor and his cultivation level is low, he must be diligent, or his spirit rice quota for next month will be docked again. He wants to use the quiet day to clear out the abandoned warehouse, sorting through the scrap metal that has rotted to dust to make space. This, of course, is his true goal for the day. The abandoned warehouse sits in the darkest corner of Key Peak, a massive stone cavern that never sees a ray of sunlight. With thousands of disciples fighting, sparring, and exploring every day, the number of broken spiritual tools is beyond counting. Those that cannot be repaired are tossed here like trash. As he pushes open the heavy, rusted iron doors, a pungent smell of rust and mildew hits him. Inside the cave, tons of broken sabers, spears, and swords are piled up like small mountains. It is a sight to behold. To anyone else, this room is nothing but a worthless junkyard, but in Yi Chinzhou's eyes, it is a massive gold mine. Left completely unguarded, he steps inside, firmly shutting the heavy doors behind him, and as an extra precaution, he heaves a discarded cauldron weighing hundreds of pounds to block the entrance. Once he is certain no one can enter, he draws the rusted iron sword from his waist. Approaching the nearest mountain of scrap, he reaches out and grabs a broken half of a mountain-cleaving blade. Immediately, his interface flashes. A broken first-tier low-grade spiritual tool has been detected and extracted. Having gained 1 point of sharpness, Shinjo orders it to be fused into his iron sword. That broken blade instantly turns into a pile of gray-white iron dust, slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, the rusted sword in his other hand gives a faint, vibrating hum. Without a moment's pause, he thrusts both hands into the pile of scrap metal and begins a frantic, unrestrained harvest. The notification sounds on his interface blur into a single continuous chime. Sharpness +3, toughness +2. Sharpness +1, toughness +5. Wherever his hands reach, hundreds of broken spiritual tools react as if they were fragile fossils weathered by 1,000 years, crumbling into fine powder. Shinjo is like a human black hole among these thousands of broken tools, madly extracting sharpness and toughness. 1 hour passes, then 2, and inside the warehouse, the mountains of junk begin to shrink at a visible rate. A thick layer of iron dust and impurities accumulates on the floor. When he finally turns the last cracked black iron shield in the corner into dust, he stops. He exhales a long breath of stale air, drenched in sweat, but feeling an incredible surge of excitement. He has squeezed every last drop of value out of thousands of broken tools. His sharpness and toughness attributes have skyrocketed by a full 30,000 points. Shinjo looks down at the rusted iron sword in his right hand, focusing on the blade's edge. Meanwhile, at the outer sect task hall, someone is nearly beaten to death. A man's scream echoes as he is thrown into the bulletin board, shattering it. Blood sprays across the ground as 2 outer sect disciples draw their weapons with bloodshot eyes. The conflict erupted over a simple task, guarding the cold soldier altar. It was a job that offered 10 low-grade spirit stones, along with 2 weeks of free access to the rich spiritual energy there. It was, to be honest, the ultimate cushy job. One disciple pointed at the other, roaring that he had seen the task first, though the board bore no names to prove it. As their insults turned into a frantic sword fight, a large crowd of disciples quickly gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. Amidst the deafening shouts, we see Yi Chinzhou pulling his head down and shrinking against the wall like a ghost. He slipped into the furthest corner of the task hall, not even sparing a glance at the 2 bloodied outer sect disciples. 10 spirit stones might sound like a lot, but in his mind, they certainly weren't worth dying for. After all, if one ended up crippled, the medical bills would far exceed the pay. He expertly moved toward the most secluded task board, where the wooden plaques were covered in a thick layer of dust. These were the grueling jobs that offered no spirit stones at all. His gaze swept past cleaning monster pens and hauling manure, finally settling on a pitch-black plaque, repairing the back mountain stairs. The reward was a mere 3 sect contribution points. It was the kind of work even a dog would refuse to do. The old stone steps had been neglected for years, and hauling those massive bluestone slabs was backbreaking work with 0 perks. Yet, Chinjo looked at it as if he'd found a legendary treasure. He snatched the plaque and ran to the counter to claim it. The clerk warned him that the stairs were mostly collapsed. Failing to finish in 3 days would cost him his monthly points. Chinjo simply claimed he preferred the quiet work. The sleepy clerk stamped the permit, and Chinjo grabbed his tools and vanished. He left in a hurry, seemingly afraid the clerk might change his mind. Half an hour later, he stood at the foot of the mountain. The place was truly deserted, without a soul in sight. Moss-covered steps stretched upward, disappearing into the mountain mist. He dropped his pickaxe and mortar to the ground, completely ignoring the broken stone slabs. He took a deep breath instead, planting his feet and pressing his hands firmly against a massive, exposed section of the mountain's rocky vein. This mountain had stood for millions of years, possessing an endless supply of solid, heavy power. Suddenly, his interface flashed. A massive and continuous heavy attribute was detected and successfully extracted. Without a moment's hesitation, Chinjo ordered it all to be fused into his skeleton and muscles. Instantly, his legs felt heavy, as if carrying hundreds of pounds. Yet when he tried to lift his feet, he found his body remained light and his movements completely unaffected. That heavy power was internal. It didn't slow him down, but made his lower body as stable as an old tree rooted deep in the rock. And so, Chinjo began to work. He lifted broken bluestone slabs weighing hundreds of pounds as easily as if they were tofu, tossing them aside while his other hand stayed pressed against the ground to maintain the extraction. Heavy +5, +10, +20. The notifications on his interface flashed like rapid fire, while others would need 5 men to lift a new stone slab. He grabbed them with one hand and kicked them precisely into the gaps of the stairs. But he didn't actually care how fast the repairs were going. His entire focus was on the skyrocketing attribute points. 1 day passed, then 2. When he was hungry, he gnawed on hard biscuits. When thirsty, he drank spring water, and when tired, he napped right on the stone steps. The power of the mountain's veins was seemingly endless. This feeling of constantly gaining free attributes made him feel like an addict who simply couldn't stop. Deep within his bones, a faint crackling sound began to echo. Beneath his skin, which had already merged with the hardness attribute, a steady dark yellow luster emerged. His body density was increasing at an exaggerated rate. By the evening of the 3rd day, as the sun began to set, the final stone slab was kicked perfectly into place by Chinjo. He stood up straight and exhaled a long breath of white mist. The once dilapidated 10,000-step staircase had been completely leveled and repaired by him alone. But what truly excited him were the numbers on his interface. His heavy attribute had reached a staggering 10,000 points. He clenched his fist, feeling like a human mountain compressed to its limit. He looked down at the bluestone beneath his feet, curious about what 10,000 points of weight concentrated in one body actually meant. He tried a small hop, and the entire back mountain shook violently, letting out a deep, muffled boom. Birds in the surrounding forest took flight in a panicked frenzy. Startled, Chinjo quickly suppressed that massive power. He forcibly suppressed those attributes deep within his body. If anyone had seen that jump, they surely would have mistaken him for some shape-shifting great demon and hauled him off for slicing and research. To be safe, he quickly grabbed his broom, acting as if nothing had happened, and strolled toward a secluded, shaded path in the back mountains to start his daily sweeping task. The commotion from repairing the stairs had been a bit much, so he needed to do some chores to divert any prying eyes. He hadn't been sweeping for even half an hour when the bushes beside the path suddenly erupted with heavy, ragged breathing, followed by the sound of snapping branches. Chinjo's ears twitched, and his broom stopped instantly. A blood-soaked figure tumbled out from the grass, collapsing headfirst onto the bluestone slabs Chinjo had just finished cleaning, staining the ground with a large pool of red. Looking closer, Chinjo saw the man was wearing a signature moon-white long robe, the attire of an inner sect disciple. However, those robes were now shredded to rags. On his chest was a deep sword wound, and his left arm was severed at the shoulder, the injury pulsing with an eerie black mist. To be honest, it was a miracle he was still alive. The inner disciple painfully raised his head, his face covered in mud, his watery eyes staring intently at Chinjo, who stood there holding his broom. Trembling, the man fumbled in his robes and pulled out a black, blood-stained jade token and a storage ring. In a raspy voice, he urged Chinjo to take these things to the front mountain immediately. To find Elder Fong of the Law Enforcement Hall, he told him to warn the elders of a traitor. If he delivered the news, the spirit stones and pills inside the ring would all be his, and Elder Fong would even guarantee his entry into the inner sect. Entering the inner sect to make a fortune, it sounded like a dream. Yet Chinjo stood his ground without even blinking, looking at that glittering storage ring without a single ripple of emotion in his heart. Had this been any other wide-eyed newcomer, they would surely be shaking with excitement, taking the ring to play the hero. But Chinzhou was thinking clearly. An inner disciple with a cultivation at least in the late stages of chi refining had been hacked into this pathetic state. Whoever was hunting him had to be a ruthless character, foundation establishment, or perhaps even higher. For a lowly handyman to go poking his nose into the power struggles or blood feuds of the inner sect's upper echelons was simply asking for death. That jade token was nothing but a death warrant, and that storage ring likely carried a spiritual tracking mark. Taking such items was practically a death sentence. Inner sect disciples of these great sects usually have a life soul lamp left back at the sect. Once they are killed, the last image they see, or the killer's aura, is likely transmitted back to that lamp. To invite such trouble for a bit of scrap metal would be pure madness. Yi Chinzhou didn't say a word. Even his breathing remained perfectly steady. He didn't step forward to help, nor did he kick the man while he was down. Instead, he simply took a step back and tightened his grip on his broom. Seeing Chinzhou retreat, the disciple grew desperate, coughing up another mouthful of blood as he screamed for him to take the items. Chinzhou ignored him completely, turning to leave. As he moved, he began to rhythmically swing his broom. Following his own retreat path, he swept layers of fallen leaves and dust over the ground, precisely covering his own footprints. The sound of the broom scraping the ground felt strangely out of place in this gloomy forest. The inner disciple, now utterly hopeless, began to curse him with a voice that grew weaker by the second. Chinzhou, however, turned a deaf ear to the insults. Let him curse. Words don't leave scars, after all. He detoured toward the dense bushes, quickly smoothing over every trace of his presence. He even used his broom to nudge broken weeds back into place, leaving no unusual marks behind. After retreating about 10 meters, Chinzhou ducked low and slipped into a patch of waist-high wild grass. He released just a fraction of his 10,000 points of heavy attribute to suppress his heartbeat and blood flow. Crouching in the dirt, his aura became as cold and silent as a buried stone. We see that he had barely hidden himself for 10 breaths when 3 dark shadows descended like ghosts, landing right beside the fallen inner disciple. A thick, suffocating murderous intent instantly filled the area, making the temperature feel as if it had dropped several degrees. The men in black scanned the surroundings, but they didn't notice Chinzhou at all, who remained motionless just 10 meters away. The 3 pursuers searched the area for a long time, but aside from the disciple's body and the black leaves, they found absolutely nothing. They wondered if the items had been snatched by a passing beast, but the leader ordered them to focus on the body. The leader ordered a full retreat, knowing the law enforcement hall would soon catch the scent. The men in black moved with practiced efficiency, pouring a bone-melting liquid over the corpse, which instantly released a plume of acrid yellow smoke. Hidden in the thicket, Yi Chinzhou remained perfectly still. He was in no rush to leave, staying crouched in that grassy nest for 2 more hours until the sky turned pitch black and even the birds in the back mountain fell silent. Only then did he stand, brushing the dirt from his clothes. He sighed, muttering that those men were truly ruthless. Shouldering his broom, he followed a deserted path, vanishing like a puff of smoke back to his dilapidated shack. He locked the door tight and even shoved a table against it. Today's events had served as a wake-up call. The sect was becoming increasingly unstable if people dared to murder inner disciples so openly. He looked down at the floor, thinking of the 3-meter-deep spike trap he'd built. It was good for catching intruders, but only if they actually stepped inside. If someone decided to be lazy and simply set the hut on fire or level it with a spell, he'd be buried alive in his own trap. He realized he had to reinforce this house. He had to stack defenses until it was practically a fortress. Chinzhou set to work immediately. He dragged out several cracked jars from under his bed, filled with the gray-white metal powder he had collected. After extracting attributes from broken spiritual tools, these scraps may have lost their sharpness and flexibility, but the base material was still high-grade iron or even rare phosphorus, or perfect for array materials. He found another chipped jar, poured in half a bowl of water, and dumped the metal powder inside. After that, he pricked his finger to add a few drops of blood as a medium and stirred the mixture vigorously with a chopstick. Soon, a bowl of thick, mud-like array ink was ready. Now, Chinzhou didn't know any profound arrays. That tattered, simple array manual he'd found only contained 2 of the most common, basic patterns. One was a warding array, used to keep rats out of rice bins, and the other was a chi-guiding array, usually reserved for venting latrines. Most cultivators wouldn't give these a second thought, as their power was pitifully small. But Chinzhou didn't care. If the quality was lacking, he would simply make up for it with sheer quantity. He knelt down, dipping his chopstick into the black ink, and began to meticulously draw the warding array patterns onto the underside of the floorboards. The design was so simple that the pattern was essentially just a few nested circles and 12 radiating lines. Even the slowest-witted servant in the sect could have copied it with ease. But after Yi Chinzhou finished the first one, he didn't stop. He drew the next one right against the edge of the first warding array, then a third and a fourth. He flipped over the floorboards and covered the undersides with a dense, crowded sea of patterns. In total, he drew 50 of them. 50 of the lowest-grade warding arrays stacked onto a single plank. Now, a single array's defensive power is roughly equal to a thin sheet of iron, but 50 of them layered together? That is the equivalent of 50 iron plates welded onto that wood. Once the floor was done, he moved on to the walls, dismantling every single plank one by one. He covered their backs with arrays before reinstalling them. From the outside, the shack still looked like a rotting pile of junk ready to collapse. But on the inside, every inch of wood was covered in a thick, pitch-black network of lines that shimmered with a faint, ghostly light. Next, he began working on the door and the window frames, applying the chi-guiding arrays with the same obsessive, almost maddening level of repetition, 50 layers for every single spot. When he finished, the entire wooden hut seemed to be embraced by an invisible shroud. If you were to walk past it now, you wouldn't even be able to sense the breath of a person inside. Shinjo finished the final stroke and straightened his back. He looked at his handiwork and nodded with deep satisfaction. To any observer, this remained the most dilapidated, pathetic shack in the area, creaking whenever the wind blew. The cracks in the door were still wide enough to fit a hand through, but in reality, the defensive power of this room was now comparable to a small fortress, with 50 layers of warding arrays. Even a late-stage chi refinement cultivator's strike would likely result in nothing but sparks. The 3-meter trap below ensured that any intruder would find no way back, while the 50 chi guiding arrays swallowed every trace of his presence. Shinjo replaced the floorboards, spread out his bedding, and made it look like a perfectly ordinary, broken wooden bed. No one would ever suspect that beneath those boards lay a 3-meter-deep lethal pit lined with poison spikes. He lay down on the bed and closed his eyes, a faint smile touching his lips. In this cutthroat world of cultivation, if one wants to survive, one must be armed to the teeth. On the surface, he remained the most unremarkable person in Kiafeng, but in secret, his little shack had been transformed into a meat grinder where people enter but never leave. As long as his system panel isn't exposed, it will keep stacking his trump cards. Only when his attributes are so high that even a golden core cultivator can't touch him will he truly show his fangs. Until then, Yi Chinzhou is content being the most honest, useless, and invisible person in all of Kiafeng. No one will make him stand out, and no one will make him take risks. He rolled over and pulled up his quilt, tucked away under the heavy protection of 50 layers of warding and chi-guiding arrays. Outside, the moonlight filtered through the cracks in the door, falling upon his peaceful face. The night in Kiafeng was as quiet as ever, and no one knew that inside this broken wooden hut lived a monster who was silently growing stronger. No one suspected that the thin, ragged servant who spent his days sweeping floors and chopping wood had already stacked enough terrifying attributes to crush a peak chi refinement expert. And all of this was just the beginning. Warding arrays nested within chi guiding arrays, large formations encircling small ones. An hour passed, and the formations on the wall were 10 layers deep. The musty smell inside the hut had completely vanished. Even the sound of his heavy breathing couldn't be heard from outside the door. But for him, this still wasn't enough. Shinjo held his broken bowl, dipping his brush to continue. 20 layers, 30 layers, 40 layers. Sweat dripped from his chin and his wrists trembled with fatigue, yet his eyes grew increasingly excited. The specialized metallic ink was drawn by the power of the formations, seeping deep into every grain of the wood. This ordinary, rotting timber was undergoing a strange and eerie spiritual transformation. As dawn approached, he finally finished the last stroke. 50 full layers of warding and chi guiding arrays were now perfectly nested and locked onto this 10 square meter shack. Shinjo tossed aside his worn-out brush, collapsed onto the floor, and gasped for air. He looked around at the walls. From the outside, the hut still looked like a pile of junk ready to be blown away by the wind. Not a single trace of the formations could be seen on the planks. The chi guiding arrays had completely masked every ripple of spiritual energy. Shinjo stood up and walked toward the wall directly facing the door. Taking a deep breath, he instantly mobilized the heavy attributes in his legs and the hardness in his hands. He was, after all, a monster who had fused 10,000 points of weight and thousands of points of hardness. A single punch from him could shatter a 1,000-pound bluestone slab into dust. He twisted his waist and struck. His right fist whistled through the air, slamming into the wall. The shack looked fragile, yet not a single splinter fell. Yi Chinzhou rubbed his slightly numb knuckles, satisfied to see that even the paint on the wood remained intact. With 50 layers of arrays stacked, this hut was likely tougher than an elder's defensive treasure. To be honest, it was overkill. He had a safe house, but deep down, he still felt uneasy. He couldn't hide inside forever without doing chores. If he encountered high-level cultivators fighting outside, he might be caught in the crossfire of their disastrous spells. A stray sword beam could be devastating. His body was tough, but he needed more trump cards to ensure his survival. The best protection would be something he could wear. Over the years, he had lived frugally, saving every bit he could. He had managed to scrape together about a dozen spirit stones. In a proper sex shop, that wouldn't buy much. He couldn't even afford the hilt of a low-grade artifact, so he decided to try his luck at the outer market stalls. The market was located in a large valley between the peaks. Shinjo changed into his most tattered, gray servant clothes. He messed up his hair and kept his head low, blending into the bustling crowd as he entered the market streets. Beautiful female cultivators stood outside grand shops, but they didn't even spare him a glance as he walked past. He headed straight for the deepest, dirtiest corner of the market. Here, goods were spread out on ragged cloths. The stalls were covered in junk, chipped flying swords, mysterious black herbs, and even muddy monster bones. Most sellers were struggling outer disciples or those desperate for quick cash. The air was thick with their shouting. One claimed to have treasures from an ancient cave for 50 stones. Yes, a likely story, we might think. Another offered fangs from a second-rank beast as premium materials. Chinjo walked on, clutching his meager savings tightly. He moved through the market like a blind man, stopping and starting at various stalls, completely ignoring the shiny, polished items that looked too good to be true. He didn't even bother asking about them. Those items had been scanned by spiritual senses 1,000 times, and any real treasures would never be left for him. Besides, they were far too expensive and would only draw unwanted attention. So he focused specifically on the stalls selling rotten stones and scrap metal. He sought out the forgotten corners where even the owners couldn't explain what they were selling. After wandering for an hour, Yichinjo stopped at a secluded spot. Before him was a tattered straw mat, tended by an outer disciple who was as thin as a monkey and currently dozing off against a wall. The mat held a few rusted iron fragments and some failed talismans, essentially worthless junk. We see Chinjo crouch down to inspect the pile. He casually poked at the iron pieces, but then, with practiced indifference, he let his gaze fall upon a black lump sitting at the edge of the mat. It was only the size of a fist, pitch black and covered in pits and bumps. To be honest, it looked like nothing more than common trash. It lacked even a hint of spiritual energy, appearing to be nothing more than slag discarded from a blacksmith's furnace. But as he had approached it, the attribute extraction panel deep within his mind had given a rare, subtle twitch. This meant the slag contained something that even the panel found interesting. Chinjo picked up a rusted iron shard, weighing it in his hand while intentionally furrowing his brow as if he were unimpressed with the quality. He asked for the price, and the monkey-like stall owner gave his servant uniform a dismissive, sidelong glance. The owner muttered a price that was clearly a bit high for such junk, testing the poor servant's resolve. Chinjo paused and sighed, acting as if he were making a difficult sacrifice. Fine, 3 stones it is, but I have a bit of a quirk, he said. With a perfectly natural movement, he reached out and grabbed the black lump that was being used as a paperweight for the mat. This rock is mine too. I'll take it back to prop up the broken leg of my bed, he added, tossing it twice. It was surprisingly heavy and felt ice-cold to the touch. He quickly counted out 3 spirit stone fragments, pressed them into the owner's hand, and clutched the black lump and the iron shard tightly. He turned and vanished into the crowd instantly. The owner blinked, looking at the stones in his hand, and then toward the direction where Chinjo had disappeared. He let out a mocking chuckle, thinking he'd found a fool who treated a piece of common or slag like a precious treasure, which, as we know, was his mistake. Half an hour later, Chinjo returned to his fortified wooden shack, where he promptly locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. Sitting cross-legged on his bed, he tossed the rusted iron fragments aside and held the black lump with both hands. He took a deep breath and issued the extraction command in his mind. Suddenly, the panel erupted with a light more intense than ever. A piercing, ghostly blue glow filled his vision as the system detected a high-purity remnant of an ancient rune within the slag. Dense cracks began to spiderweb across the surface of the black lump, and layers of dark crust peeled away like dried mud. The debris turned to powder and slipped through his fingers. In less than 3 breaths, the fist-sized object had shrunk significantly. All that remained was a shimmering object the size of a fingernail. It wasn't just a simple attribute, but a complex, miniature structure. A blood-red rune, tangled like a tiny formation map, hovered half an inch above his palm, emitting a truly terrifying aura. The panel flashed with a success message. He had obtained a special rare trait, the Thorn's Rune, which, as we'll see, is quite formidable. The effect was simple, yet devastating. When suffering a physical or spiritual attack, it would absorb the incoming force. It would then reflect 100% of that damage back to the attacker instantly. Yichinjo gasped at the sheer potential. His eyes widened. 100% reflection meant that as long as an opponent couldn't kill him in a single strike, even if they were a powerful cultivator, a strike against him would result in them receiving that same lethal blow themselves. Combined with his massive defense and turtle shell hardness, anyone who hit him would be out of luck. To be honest, it's almost unfair. The panel prompted him to choose a location for fusion. Chinjo pulled open his tattered gray coat, revealing his inner layer. It was a rough, faded leather vest covered in patches, a second-hand piece he'd traded for when he first joined the sect. Without a moment's hesitation, he fused the Thorn's Rune directly into this inner armor. A strange, dark red luster washed over the leather. The glow soon faded, leaving the armor looking just as shabby and pathetic as before. A perfect disguise, wouldn't you agree? Early the next morning, we see Chinjo carrying 2 large wooden buckets to the forest fields to water the crops, as usual. The sun was blinding and the air stifling. Nearby, Zhou Dazhuang was wiping sweat while quietly cursing the supervisor, Zhao Taizan. Taizhan had apparently docked their meager rations again. But just then, a sound echoed from the depths of the back mountain. From the distance, a sudden, muffled horn blast echoed, shrill, piercing, and incredibly powerful. It was unlike anything they had heard before. This wasn't the usual bronze bell used to summon disciples. Yi Qinzhou paused, his wooden ladle mid-air, as the ground beneath him began to tremble. At first, it was just a faint vibration, causing ripples to dance across the water in his buckets. But within a few breaths, everything changed. The shaking intensified violently, as if hundreds of warhorses were charging at full speed. Zhou Dazhuang straightened his back, looking around in a daze. He stared toward the back mountain, wondering aloud if the earth itself was turning over. Suddenly, a sharp-eyed servant let out a terrified scream. The perimeter fence, built 2 stories high from sturdy ironwood to keep out intruders, was shredded as easily as if it were made of paper. Wood splinters filled the air as a dozen beasts, each the size of a small calf, burst through with blood-red eyes and a primal fury. They charged directly into the crowd of servants. These were the spirit beasts from the mountain. They had gone mad. A riot had begun. The forest fields erupted into chaos. These low-level spirit beasts, usually docile enough to pull carts for the sect, had now lost all reason. Leading the charge were several first-rank steel-toothed boars, their bodies covered in stiff black bristles and their tusks sharper than daggers. They lowered their heads, goring anyone in their path. One elderly servant, too slow to react, didn't even have time to let out a cry. He was struck squarely in the waist by a charging boar and thrown aside. The servants completely collapsed into a state of pure, unadulterated panic. Most were only at the 2nd or 3rd level of chi refining, possessing no real combat spells and armed only with hoes and sickles. Against a pack of frenzied demonic beasts, it was a one-sided slaughter. The scene turned into a chaotic mess in an instant. Some fled toward the mountain, others scrambled into huts, and many simply collapsed in terror. Qinzhou, however, stood his ground with a furrowed brow. He didn't run. To be honest, he didn't really need to. In his eyes, these low-level beasts were no sturdier than paper tigers. He knew he could punch the life out of a steel-toothed boar with a single blow. But he hesitated. A spirit beast riot was a major event, and intersect elders were likely watching from above on their flying swords. If a lowly servant at the 1st level of chi refining were seen killing a first-rank beast with one punch, questions would certainly be asked. If the higher-ups saw that, he'd likely end up on a dissection table by morning. He couldn't fight, yet he couldn't run. Qinzhou's gaze narrowed. His eyes swept across the area with lightning speed, spotting several rift wolves nearby that had just lunged at a group of fleeing servants. The beasts were pinning them down, and 4 or 5 unconscious servants already lay scattered across the ground. Yi Qinzhou took a deep breath. Without a moment's hesitation, he charged toward them, not to save anyone, mind you, but to borrow the scenery for a little performance. He reached the fallen servants, stepped into a dark puddle of mud, and scooped up a handful of black blood to smear across his face and neck. With a violent tug, he shredded the fabric of his chest and sleeves into tattered strips, perfectly mimicking the jagged wounds left by a beast's claws. The entire transformation was seamless, executed with the grace of a seasoned actor. Once the disguise was set, Qinzhou threw himself onto the ground. He lay motionless beside the fallen crowd, playing dead with remarkable attention to detail, even pinning a piece of torn clothing beneath his back. He buried half his face in the muddy water, leaving only a single nostril clear for breathing while channeling his 10,000 points of heavy attribute. He forcibly slowed his heartbeat and the flow of his blood. His breathing became nearly non-existent, and his body temperature began to drop rapidly. Now, even if someone were to check him closely, they would simply assume he was a fresh corpse. All around him, the screams of the dying continued. We hear the sickening sound of flesh being torn and bones being crunched by the beasts. The entire area had transformed into a literal slaughterhouse. The scent of fresh blood only served to drive the spirit beasts into a deeper frenzy, and they began to flatten the wooden huts and fields like living bulldozers. Qinzhou kept his eyes shut, his mind as calm as a still lake. To be honest, his plan was quite simple: just survive this initial wave. Once the sect's formation teams and inner masters arrived, these low-intelligence beasts would be suppressed instantly. He just needed to wait. He intended to be nothing more than a convincing piece of the background scenery. Suddenly, a heavy, foul-smelling breath puffed against his ear. The ground vibrated with slow, heavy footsteps as a massive spirit beast wandered over to the pile of bodies with casual indifference. Its hooves made a wet, squelching sound in the mud. Qinzhou felt a damp, sandpaper-rough tongue lick the corpse lying right next to him. It seemed to be browsing, trying to decide which piece of meat was the freshest. Then, the beast's snout moved toward Qinzhou's position. It began to sniff back and forth, exhaling a hot, rancid breath that blew directly against the back of his neck. This was getting a bit too close for comfort. The creature was a mid-grade, first-rank armored bear, a beast larger than an adult bull and covered in hide as tough as iron. Its fur stood up like steel needles, a clear warning of its nature. This beast was not only incredibly strong, but also possessed a hide so thick it was nearly impenetrable. Even a cultivator in the late stages of chi refining wouldn't dare face it head-on. Yet, Yi Chinzhou remained as still as a stone, his eyelids not even flickering. The armored bear let out a low, muffled growl from deep within its throat. It slowly raised a massive paw, larger than a man's head and caked in filth and dried mud. With a sudden, violent motion, it brought that paw down with a force of at least 1,000 pounds. It was a strike intended to crush everything beneath it. Against an ordinary servant, such a blow would have shattered their spine and pulverized their internal organs instantly. But as the paw made contact with Chinzhou's back, in that split second of impact, the tattered beast's skin armor pressed against his flesh reacted. Without any warning, a hidden power began to stir. A faint, blood-red runic light flashed across the surface of the armor. A system notification appeared. External physical attack detected. Counter-damage rune activated. The damage was reflected back at 100%, combined with the 10,000 points of heavy attribute and 1,000 points of hardness within his body. Chinzhou was currently less like a man and more like an anvil forged from eternal black iron, rooted deep into the very earth itself. The armored bear's heavy, devastating strike slammed into this immovable anvil. To be honest, it was the worst mistake the creature could have made. The rune perfectly captured every ounce of the reactionary force in an instant, then violently unleashed it back upon the attacker. And then, we hear it. A sickening, bone-snapping sound echoed through the air, momentarily drowning out the screams of the surrounding chaos. The bear didn't even have time to cry out. Its thick right arm, from the paw all the way up to the shoulder, seemed to have been stuffed with explosives. It simply detonated from the inside out. Debris flew everywhere as the hard arm bone shattered into hundreds of sharp fragments. It was a gruesome sight, to say the very least. In less than a second, half of its arm was reduced to a cloud of black mist by the sheer force of its own strength. It was a literal self-destruction. The massive shockwave didn't just ruin its limb. It traveled through the shoulder blade to completely destroy the beast's internal organs. The damage was absolute. Only then did the armored bear finally let out a shrill, agonizing scream that tore through the air, marking its final moments of life. Its massive body was sent flying backward like a tattered sack of grain, crashing heavily into the fields 2 meters away and flattening a large patch of crops. It twitched violently in the muddy water, its remaining left claw scratching uselessly at the ground while it coughed up mouthfuls of dark fluid and organ fragments. After struggling for less than 10 breaths, the creature finally went still. It was dead, leaving our protagonist once again in silence. Throughout the entire ordeal, Yi Chinzhou remained lying in the pile of corpses without even knitting his brows. When that massive paw had slammed down, he felt as though someone had given his back a firm but harmless massage. Not even his skin was broken, while that unfortunate bear, well, it had effectively sent itself to the afterlife. Chinzhou continued to play dead, waiting for the sex array team to arrive and clear the mess. The dead bear lay just 2 meters away, providing him with the perfect cover. Other nearby demonic beasts, hearing the shrill, agonizing death cries of their own kind, felt an instinctive surge of terror and began to avoid Chinzhou's immediate area. Instead, they turned to hunt the other servants who were still running in chaos. A short while later, a series of sharp whistling sounds pierced the air above. Over a dozen dazzling streaks of light from flying swords cut through the sky like meteors, carrying a chilling and murderous intent as they came to a steady halt midair. Leading them was an intersect array hall deacon dressed in a black-bordered robe. The deacon was furious, releasing his spiritual pressure without restraint, forcing the frenzied low-level beasts below to collapse to the ground, trembling in fear. With a thunderous shout, he gave the order, "Kill them all, leave not a single one alive." Behind him, over a dozen array team disciples performed sword hand signs simultaneously, sending their blades flying like blurred shadows across the fields. One by one, the massive heads of the demonic beasts rolled onto the ground. These creatures, who had seemed like gods of death to the servants, were as fragile as common cabbages before the intersect elites. In less than a few minutes, over a dozen beasts were completely wiped out. The leading deacon coldly commanded his subordinates to clear the scene, treat the wounded, and collect the beast carcasses. The inner organs and pelts were to be sent back to the sect's treasury. Having finished, he stepped onto his sword to patrol other areas. A few array team disciples sheathed their swords and landed with looks of utter disgust in the muddy, blood-soaked fields. A stout disciple complained about how useless the servants were, letting a few rank 1 beasts kill so many of them, all while kicking aside the remains blocking his path. The two of them walked and stopped, soon arriving at the pile of bodies where Yi Chinzhou lay. Suddenly, the taller disciple stopped in his tracks, pointing at the armored bear's corpse and calling his companion over. They both knelt beside the massive body, staring at the shattered right side of its frame in total bewilderment, unable to fathom how it had literally shaken itself to death. The tall disciple used his sword sheath to poke at the pile of shattered bone fragments, muttering that it was truly bizarre. He wondered if this bear had perhaps gone completely overboard with its frenzy, causing its own spiritual energy to explode. Its entire right arm and half its ribs were crushed into sand, a truly pathetic way to die. The stout disciple stood further away, covering his nose, and remarked that it didn't matter how it died. Low-level beasts were prone to such internal collapses when they lost control. He urged his companion to register the kill and harvest the materials. The two quickly pulled out their skinning knives to carve out the intact parts of the armored bear's pelt and its core. The stout disciple even stuffed the one remaining good bear paw into his storage bag, likely planning a heavy midnight snack for later that evening. Just as the two were preparing to step onto their flying swords and head to the next sector, a sound suddenly drifted up from the pile of corpses on the ground. It was an incredibly weak, trembling voice. Yi Chinzhou had timed it perfectly, opening his eyes at just the right moment, his face covered in filth and his body shaking violently like a leaf in the wind. He began crawling backward through the mud, using both hands and feet, screaming in a voice filled with pure terror, begging the beast not to eat him because his meat was sour and tasted terrible. To be honest, it was a very convincing performance. That look of soul-shattering fright was even more realistic than someone who had actually been driven mad. The tall disciple glanced at him with a cold, mocking sneer. He told Chinzhou to stop howling, as the beasts were all dead. He remarked that the boy was lucky to have been buried under the corpses, which had hidden him from the slaughter. He told him to get to the steward's office for medicine, and then the two disciples took to the sky in a flash of sword light. Chinzhou sat paralyzed in the muddy water, watching the light fade into the distance. Suddenly, the look of terror on his face vanished, leaving him perfectly calm once more. He slowly and methodically wiped the filth from his face, patted the dirt off his clothes, and stood up. This spirit beast riot had lasted for half an hour before being quelled. The servant quarters suffered heavy casualties, with bodies scattered everywhere, and the cleanup alone took an entire day. The next morning, the steward Zhao Taizhan looked absolutely miserable. In the sector he was responsible for, dozens of servants had died, and the fields were mostly trampled. He knew the higher-ups would hold him accountable. To settle the survivors' nerves, the outer sect elders did something quite rare. They actually allocated a sum of compensation money. We see Chinzhou blending into the line of people waiting for their pay, having intentionally made himself look disheveled. He walked with a limp, his eyes vacant, occasionally muttering nonsense about giant bears under his breath to maintain the act. When it was finally his turn, the disciple in charge of the funds flipped through the register, looked up at his pathetic state, and marked him down as a survivor from the worst-hit forest area. He was granted 10 low-grade spirit stones and 2 bottles of blood-stanching pills, along with 3 days of rest from labor. Yi Chinzhou extended a trembling hand, clutching the bag tightly as he retreated with 1,000 thanks. 10 spirit stones was an absolute fortune for a servant. Usually, they worked themselves to the bone for a month just for a few pounds of silver. Chinzhou didn't waste a single moment, slipping away from the servant quarters immediately after receiving his pay and heading straight for the Fong clan's shop. He currently possessed an array of monstrous attributes, but his physical foundation was still that of a weak, first-level chi refiner. If he didn't fully refine these attributes into the depths of his marrow, a single spell from a true master could leave his skin intact while shattering his internal organs. He needed a large-scale physical reconstruction. Upon arriving at the Fong shop, Chinzhou went straight to the counter where body-tempering materials were sold. He heroically slapped his 10 spirit stones onto the counter, demanding 5 jars of the most potent flame tiger essence blood. He also requested 10 packs of bone-breaking grass and iron-skin immortal herb, insisting on the oldest stock. To be honest, it was quite a bold request. The shopkeeper stared at this boy in tattered servant clothes for a moment, but following the principle of never turning away profit, he smiled and packed it all. After buying the materials, Chinzhou jogged along the walls back to his room, the one protected by 50 layers of formations. He locked the door, moved the bed to reveal the 3-meter-deep hole beneath, and jumped inside. We see him carefully clearing away the poison powder and wooden spikes he had previously laid out. He then dragged a large wooden tub from his storage bag. He placed the tub in the center of the hole, pouring all 10 packs of bone-breaking grass and iron-skin immortal herb inside. Next, he dumped the 5 jars of flame tiger blood in and used a fire starter to light a blaze beneath the tub. Before long, the dark red medicinal liquid began to boil, bubbling with a pungent, fishy stench mixed with a sharp herbal fragrance. In any normal situation, a first-level chi refiner jumping into such a concentrated medicinal bath would have their blood vessels burst instantly. But Chinzhou didn't care. He quickly stripped off his outer robe and even set aside his inner armor with the counter-damage runes. Taking a deep breath, he plunged himself into the scalding, boiling medicinal liquid. It was a move that looked incredibly painful. The moment he entered, it felt as though countless red-hot needles were frantically piercing into his pores, driven by the violent energy of the tiger blood. The violent energy forced its way through his pores and into his veins. Yi Chinzhou's eyes bulged as he let out a silent internal roar, commanding the interface to pour every single attribute into the liquid. The panel accepted, initiating a deep physical reconstruction. A warning flashed. The process would involve extreme pain, and he had to remain conscious. Meanwhile, the boiling medicinal liquid became the perfect catalyst. On the interface, his hardness, poison resistance, heaviness, and counter-damage attributes began to fuse completely with his bones. Shinjo endured that agonizing reconstruction, lying still for 2 full days and nights before he finally recovered. Those violent drops of essence, blood, and herbs were crushed by the panel and hammered into his marrow and flesh. On the surface, he still looked like that same scrawny, first-level chi refiner servant. In reality, however, the density of his physical frame had reached an utterly terrifying level. His 3 major attributes had merged into one. If he were sent back to the mountain to clear rocks now, he wouldn't even need tools. He could likely headbutt the mountain and crack it in half. Late that night, dark clouds obscured the moon, leaving not a single star in sight. In the woods on the mountain's edge, the insects had gone eerily silent. Suddenly, a figure draped in black robes stumbled out of the thicket, collapsing face first into the muddy ground while gasping for air. Instantly, a pungent, rotting stench filled the atmosphere. The man gritted his teeth, cursing the mad dogs of the Heaven Mystery Sect's punishment hall for chasing him so relentlessly. By the faint moonlight, we see that half of his face was covered in dried, purple-black blood. On his right ribs, a sword wound cut deep enough to show bone. Black mist hissed from the edges of the gash, preventing it from healing. This man was a demonic cultivator known as Chi-Mo. With an 8th-level chi refining cultivation, he had sneaked into the sect's territory to feast on the essence of outer disciples. Unfortunately, he was caught red-handed by the inner court elites. 3 flying swords had hunted him for a day and a night. After using every trump card and sustaining heavy injuries, he finally escaped to this neglected servant quarter. Chi-Mo's energy was depleted, and his demonic aura could no longer suppress his wounds. If he didn't find a blood bag to replenish himself soon, he was finished. His bloodshot eyes stared like a hungry wolf at the nearby servant huts. In his current state, he knew he couldn't outrun the sect's guards. He desperately needed a scapegoat to absorb their essence and heal his wounds before the sect's grand array closed in. His plan was simple: dress the victim in his black robes, fake his own death, and slip away unnoticed like a cicada shedding its skin. Chi-Mo's gaze swept across the rows of dilapidated wooden huts at the edge of the servant quarters. Targeting someone with a high cultivation was too risky, and huts that were too crowded would surely cause a commotion. To be honest, he needed someone isolated. Suddenly, his eyes locked onto the most remote and broken-down shack in the corner. As fate would have it, this was Yi Chinjo's humble residence. Chi-Mo let out a raspy chuckle and licked his cracked lips. The shack looked like it had been abandoned for centuries, leaking wind from every single corner. He assumed the person inside must be the lowest-tier trash, someone who couldn't even afford spiritual rice. Moving like a night owl skimming the ground, he approached the door without making a sound. He didn't rush to push it open, however, showing the caution of a seasoned predator. Instead, he extended his divine sense to scan the area. He found no fluctuations of any defensive arrays, just ordinary, rotting wood. It was pathetic, really. What he didn't know was that Chinjo's 50 layers of concealment arrays had completely masked the spiritual energy of the inner barriers. To Chi-Mo, an experienced 8th-level chi refiner, this appeared to be nothing more than a pile of junk. Fearing the creak of a door, he decided on a different approach. He pulled a crumpled talisman from his robes and slapped it onto his chest, instantly transforming into a faint, murky shadow. He flowed through the gap under the door like liquid. While the 50 layers of barriers could stop physical blows, they weren't designed to block such sneaky shadow-stepping arts. We return to the scene where Chinjo stepped forward, looking down at Chi-Mo, who was now quite dead, his eyes still wide with lingering shock. Leaving the corpse of a high-level demonic cultivator in his room would be a massive problem, which, naturally, was the last thing he wanted. The scent of blood was far too strong and would surely attract the overseers or the patrol teams by morning. Without hesitation, he reached out his hand. He hovered his palm over Chi-Mo's remains and issued an extraction command. The interface immediately pinged, detecting a high concentration of demonic spiritual energy. The system confirmed the target was deceased and began stripping away the impurities to refine the core essence from the mixture of blood and energy. As the blue light of the interface flickered, the 2 gruesome halves of the corpse, along with the spilled blood and shattered organs, began to change. Even the black robes started to weather and disintegrate at a visible speed. In much less than 10 hours, in just a few moments, in fact, a grown man had completely vanished, leaving not a single drop of blood behind. In his place, a new prize appeared in Yi Chinjo's palm. What remained was a small pile of dark red powder, radiating an incredibly dense and pure spiritual aura of vegetation. It was, to be honest, completely odorless, with no hint of blood. This was the refined essence of an 8th-level chi refiner's entire cultivation and physical body. Yi Chinjo casually tucked Chi-Mo's shriveled storage bag into his robes, then found a piece of tattered cloth to carefully wrap the powder. With practiced, nimble movements, he picked up the broken wooden wall panels and used mud and a few iron nails to seal them back up, adding a few simple illusion arrays for good measure. Just as he finished, the horizon began to pale with the first light of dawn. The next day, Chinjo appeared at the spiritual fields right on time for watering. That powerful demonic cultivator from the night before had been refined into a handful of nutrient-rich fertilizer buried deep within the soil. Months later, in the bitter winds of the spiritual fields, the few acres under Chinzhou's care showed an almost exaggerated growth. The spiritual stalks were as thick as saplings, bearing golden, plump grains so rich in energy they practically dripped with moisture. The overseer, Zhao Taizhan, stood on the ridge overlooking this harvest, his face trembling with a wide, greedy grin. He actually patted Chinzhou's shoulder, tossing a half-piece of a spirit stone in his hand. He noted that this yield didn't just cover previous losses, it made him look excellent in front of his superiors. He declared that Chinzhou was to stay on this field permanently. If anyone caused him trouble, they would have to answer to him. Chinzhou accepted the fragment of spirit stone with both hands, bowing slightly with a simple, honest smile. He thanked the overseer for the promotion, claiming he had no ambition and simply enjoyed working with the earth. As Zhao Taizhan walked away humming, Chinzhou slowly straightened his back and slipped the stone fragment into his pocket. He picked up a long-handled wooden ladle and unhurriedly poured spiritual spring water onto the center of the field, right at the base of the thickest, strongest stalk. Deep within the soil, a faint trace of dark red demonic energy flickered, something only he could perceive. It was the last, lingering bit of Qi Mo's demonic origin. However, the moment this aura surfaced, a heavy, grounding force seeped from Chinzhou's foot, suppressing it instantly and crushing it into pure nutrients for the field. Deep down, Chinzhou couldn't help but marvel at how effective an 8th-level cultivator was as fertilizer, though it was nearly used up. He shouldered his tools and sighed. He brushed the mud from his hands and called up the interface in his mind, looking at rows of data so exaggerated they would make high-level cultivators question reality itself. Satisfied, he stretched his legs just as the bronze bell from the front mountain echoed through the clouds once more. Several brilliant streaks of light cut across the sky above Qi Peak. These were the intersect geniuses, flying in groups on their treasures, rushing off to some newly discovered secret realm to fight to the death. Yi Chinzhou looked up at those dazzling sword lights for a moment, curled his lip, and felt not even a shred of envy. Let them fight and grab. While they were busy killing each other, he would simply carry his sack to the edge of the battlefield to scavenge and extract attributes. The waters of the cultivation world were far too deep and the waves too high. Chinzhou decided he wasn't going anywhere. He would stay right here on drafty Qi Peak, farming and sweeping, quietly making his fortune until he was invincible under heaven. He turned around, humming an unknown tune, and walked slowly toward his wooden hut, the one protected by 50 layers of hidden arrays. The setting sun stretched his thin shadow long across the most remote path of the peak, a quiet end to the day. No one noticed the faint, subtle smile on the lips of this most unremarkable handyman, and no one knew that here, on the most desolate mountain at the very bottom of the sect, a monster was silently growing stronger. A legend, we might say, had quietly taken shape. And yet, our story has only just begun. Presented by Yo-Yo Television Series Exclusive. 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 Presented by Yo-Yo Television Series Exclusive.